Moved by a gratitude and satisfaction beyond words, Carter made plans with the ghoulish leaders for his audacious voyage. The army would fly high, they decided, over hideous Leng with its nameless monastery and wicked stone villages, stopping only at the vast gray peaks to confer with the Shantek, frightening night gaunts, whose burrows honeycombed their summits. They would then, according to what advice they might receive from those denizens, choose their final course. Approaching unknown Kadath, either through the desert of Carbon Mountains, north of Inquanak, or through the more northerly reaches of the repulsive Leng itself, dog-like and soulless as they are, the ghouls and night gaunts had no dread of what those untrodden deserts might reveal, nor did they feel any deterring awe at the thought of Kadath towering lone with its Ank's castle of mystery. About midday the ghouls and night gaunts prepared for flight, each ghoul selecting a suitable pair of horned steeds to bear him. Carter was placed well up toward the head of the column beside Pickman, and in front of the whole a double line of riderless night gaunts was provided as a vanguard. At a brisk meep from Pickman, the whole shocking army rose in a nightmare cloud above the broken columns and crumbling sphinxes of primordial sarcomund, and higher, till even the great basalt cliff behind the town was cleared, and the cold, sterile tableland of Leng's outskirts laid open to sight. Still higher flew the black host, till even this tableland grew small beneath them, and as they worked northward over the wind-swept plateau of horror, Carter saw once again, with a shudder, the circle of crude monoliths and the squat, windowless building, which he knew held that frightful, silken, masked blasphemy from whose clutches he had so narrowly escaped. This time, no descent was made, as the army swept bat-like over the sterile landscape, passing the feeble fires of the unwholesome stone villages at a great altitude, and pausing not at all to mark the morbid twistings of the hooved, horned, almost humans that dance and pipe eternally therein. Once they saw a Shantak bird flying low over the plain, but when it saw them, it screamed noxiously and flapped off to the north in grotesque panic. At dusk, they reached the jagged, gray peaks that formed the Barrier of Inquanak and hovered about these strange caves near the summits which Carter recalled as so frightful to the Shantaks. At the insistent meeting of the ghoulish leaders, there issued forth from each lofty burrow a stream of horned black flyers with which the ghouls and night gaunts of the party conferred at length by means of ugly gestures. It soon became clear that the best course would be that over the cold waste north of Inquanak, for Leng's northward reaches are full of unseen pitfalls that even the night gaunts dislike, abysmal influences centering in certain white hemispherical buildings on curious knolls, which common folk lore associates unpleasantly with the other entities and their crawling chaos Nyarlathotep. Of Kadath, the flutterers of the peaks knew almost nothing save that there must be some mighty marvel toward the north over which the Shantaks and the Carbon Mountains stand guard. They hinted at rumored abnormalities of proportion in those trackless leagues beyond, and recalled vague whispers of a realm where night broods eternally. But of definite data they had nothing to give, so Carter and his party thanked them kindly, and crossing the topmost granite pinnacles to the skies of Inquanak, dropped below the level of the phosphorescent night clouds, and beheld in the distance those terrible squatting gargoyles that were mountains, till some Titan hand carved fright into the virgin rock. There they squatted in a hellish half-circle, their legs on the desert sand and their mitres piercing the luminous clouds, sinister, wolf-like, and double-headed, with the faces of fury and the right hands raised dully and malignly, watching the rim of man's world and guarding with horror the reaches of a cold northern world that is not man's. From their hideous laps rose evil shantucks of elephantine bulk, but these all fled with insane titters as the vanguard of night gaunts was slighted in the misty sky. Northward, above those gargoyle mountains, the army flew, and over leagues of dim desert, where never a landmark rose, less and less luminous grew the clouds, till at length Carter could see only blackness around him, but never did the winged steeds falter, bred as they were in earth's blackest crypts, and seeing not with any eyes, but with the whole dank surface of their slippery forms, and on they flew past winds of dubious scent and sounds of dubious import, ever in thickest darkness and covering such prodigious spaces that Carter wondered whether or not they could still be within Earth's dreamland. Then suddenly the clouds thinned and the stars shone spectrally above. All below was still black, but those pallid beacons in the sky seemed alive with a meaning and directiveness they had never possessed elsewhere. It was not that the figures of the constellations were different, but that the same familiar shapes now revealed a significance that they had formerly failed to make plain. Everything focused toward the north. Every curve and asterism of the glittering sky became part of a vast design whose function was to hurry first the eye and then the whole observer onward to some secret and terrible goal of convergence beyond the frozen waste that stretched endlessly ahead. Carter looked toward the east, where the great ridge of barrier peaks had towered along the length of Inquannock, and saw against the stars a jagged silhouette which told of its continued presence. It was more broken now, with yawning clefts and fantastically erratic pinnacles, and Carter studied closely the suggestive turnings and inclinations of that grotesque outline, which seemed to share with the stars some subtle northward urge. They were flying past at a tremendous speed, so that the watcher had to strain hard to catch details, when all at once he beheld just above the line of the topmost peaks a dark and moving object against the stars, whose course exactly paralleled that of his own bizarre party. Magool's had likewise glimpsed it, for he heard their low glibbering all about him, and for a moment he fancied the object was a gigantic shantak, of a size vastly greater than that of the average specimen. Soon, however, he saw that this theory would not hold, for the shape of the thing above the mountains was not that of any hypocephalic bird. Its outline against the stars, necessarily vague as it was, resembled rather some huge mitred head, or pair of heads infinitely magnified, and its rapid bobbing flight through the sky, seemed most peculiarly a wingless one. Carter could not tell which side of the mountains it was on, but soon perceived that it had parts below the parts he had not first seen, since it blotted out all the stars in places where the ridge was deeply cleft. Then came a wide gap in the range, where the hideous reaches of the Trans Montane Lang were joined to the cold waste on this side by a low pass through which the stars shone wanly. Carter watched this gap with intense care, knowing that he might see outlined against the sky beyond it the lower parts of the vast thing that flew undulatingly above the pinnacles. The object had now floated ahead a trifle, and every eye of the party was fixed on the rift where it would presently appear in full-length silhouette. Gradually the huge thing above the peaks neared the gap, slightly slackening its speed, as if conscious of having outdistanced the ghoulish army. For another minute, suspense was keen, and then the brief instant of full silhouette and revelation came, bringing to the lips of the ghouls an odd and half-choked meep of cosmic fear, and to the soul of the traveler a chill that never wholly left it. For the mammoth, bobbing shape that overtopped the ridge was only a head. A metered double head, and below it, terrible vastness, lopped the frightful, swollen body that bore it, the mountain-high monstrosity that walked in stealth and silence, in the hyena-like distortion of a giant anthropoid shape that trotted blackly against the sky, its repulsive pair of cone-capped heads reaching halfway to the zenith. Carter did not lose consciousness or even scream aloud, for he was an old dreamer, for he looked behind him in horror and shuddered when he saw that there were other monstrous heads silhouetted above the level of the peaks, bobbing along stealthily after the first one, and straight in the rear were three of the mighty mountain shapes, seen fully against the southern stars, tiptoeing wolf-like and lumberingly, their tall miters nodding thousands of feet in the air. The carven mountains then had not stayed squatting in that rigid semicircle north of Inquannock. With right hands uplifted, they had duties to perform, and were not remiss. But it was horrible, and they never spoke, and never even made a sound in walking. Meanwhile, the ghoul, that was Pickman, had gibbered an order to the night gaunt's, and the whole army soared higher into the air, up towards the stars. The grotesque column shot, till nothing stood out any longer against the sky, neither the gray granite ridge that was still, nor the carven, metered mountains that walked. All was blackness beneath, as the fluttering legion stirred northwards, amid rushing winds and invisible laughter in the aether. And never a shantek, or less mentionable entity, rose from the haunted waste to pursue them. The farther they went, the faster they flew, till soon their dizzying speed seemed to pass that of a rifle ball and approach that of a planet in its orbit. Carter wondered how, with such speed, the earth could still stretch beneath them, but knew that in the land of dream dimensions have strange properties, and even strangers, that of spirit, than the psychic. That they were in a realm of eternal light he felt certain, and he fancied that the constellations overhead had subtly emphasized their northward focus, gathering themselves up, as it were, to cast the flying army into the void of the boreal pole, as the folds of a bag are gathered up to cast out the last bits of substance therein. Then he noticed with terror that the wings of the night gaunts were not flapping anymore. The horned and faceless steeds had folded their membranous appendages and were resting, quite passive in the chaos of the wind that whirled and chuckled as it bore them on. A force not of earth had seized on the army, and ghouls and night gaunts alike were powerless before a current which pulled madly and relentlessly to the north, whence no mortal had ever returned. At length, a lone, pallid light was seen on the skyline ahead, thereafter rising steadily as they approached, and having beneath it a black mass that blotted out the stars. Carter saw that it must be some beacon on a mountain, for only a mountain could rise so vast as seen from so prodigious a height in the air. Higher and higher rose the light and the blackness beneath it, till half the northern sky was obscured by the rugged, conical mass. Lofty as the army was, that pale and sinister beacon rose above it, towering, monstrous, over all peaks and concernments of earth, and tasting the atomless aether, where the cryptical moon and the mad planet's reel. No mountain known of man was that which loomed before them. The high clouds far below were but a fringe for its foothills. The groping dizziness of topmost air was but a girdle for its loins. Scornful and spectral climbed that bridge betwixt earth and heaven, black in eternal night, and crowned with a bescent of unknown stars whose awful and significant outline grew every moment clearer. Ghouls meeked in wonder as they saw it, and Carter shivered in fear lest all the hurtling army be dashed to pieces on the unyielding onks of that cyclopean cliff. Higher and higher rose that light, till it mingled with the loftiest orbs of the zenith, and winked down at the flyers with lurid mockery. All the north beneath it was blackness now, dread stony blackness from infinite depths to infinite heights, with only that pale winking beacon perched unreachably at the top of all vision. Carter studied the light more closely and saw at last what lines his inky background made against the stars. There were towers on that Titan mountaintop, horrible domed towers in noxious and incalculable tiers and clusters beyond any dreamable workmanship of man. Battlements and terraces of wonder and menace, all limned, tiny, and black and distant against the starry bescent that glowed malevolently at the uppermost rim of sight. Capping that most measureless of mountains was a castle beyond all mortal thought, and in it glowed the diamond light. Then Randolph Carter knew that his quest was done, and that he saw above him the goal of all forbidden steps and audacious visions, the fabulous, incredible home of the great ones, atop unknown Kadath. Kind of like a Mount Olympus, but a bit more obscure and sinister. Even as he realized this thing, Carter noticed a change in the course of the helplessly wind-sucked party. They were rising abruptly now, and it was plain that the focus of their flight was the Ank's castle, where the pale light shone. So close was the great black mountain that its sides sped by them dizzily as they shot upwards, and in the darkness they could discern nothing upon it. Vaster and vaster loomed the tenebrous towers of the nighted castle above, and Carter could see that it was well-nigh blasphemous in its immensity. Well might its stones have been quarried by nameless workmen in that horrible gulf rent out of the rock in the hill past the north of Inquanac. For such was its size that a man on its threshold stood, even as air out on the steps of earth's loftiest fortress. The bescent of unknown stars above the myriad domed turrets glowed with a sallow, sickly flare, so that a kind of twilight hung about the murky walls of slippery onks. The pallid beacon was now seen to be a single shining window high up in one of the loftiest towers, and the helpless army neared the top of the mountain. Carter thought he detected unpleasant shadows flitting across the feebly luminous expanse. It was a strangely arched window of a design wholly alien to earth. The solid rock now gave place to the giant foundations of a monstrous castle, and it seemed that the speed of the party was somewhat abated. Vast walls shut up, and there was a glimpse of a great gate through which the voyagers were swept. All was night in the Titan courtyard, and then came the deeper blackness of inmost things as a huge arched portal engulfed the column. Vortices of cold wind surged dankly through sightless labyrinths of onks, and Carter could never tell what cyclopean stairs and corridors lay silent along the route of his endless aerial twisting. Always upward led the terrible plunge in darkness, and never a sound, touch, or glimpse broke the dense pall of mystery. Large as the army of ghouls and night gaunts was, it was lost in the prodigious void ghosts of that more than earthly castle, and when at last there suddenly dawned around him the lurid light of the singular tower room whose lofty window had served as a beacon, it took Carter long to discern the far walls and huge, high ceiling, and to realize that he was indeed not again in the boundless air outside. Randolph Carter had hoped to come into the throne room of the great ones with poise and dignity, flanked and followed by impressive lines of ghouls in ceremonial order, and offering his prayer as a free and potent master among dreamers. He had known that the great ones themselves are not beyond a mortal's power to cope with, and had trusted to luck that the other entities and their crawling chaos Nyarlathotep would not happen to come to their aid at the crucial moment, as they had so often done before when men sought out Earth's entities in their home or in their mountains. And with his hideous escort, he had half hoped to defy even the other entities if needed were, knowing, as he did, that ghouls have no masters, and that night gaunts own not Nyarlathotep, but only archaic Nodens for their lord. But now he saw that supernal Kadath, and its cold waste, is indeed girt with dark wonders and nameless sentinels, and that other entities are of a surety vigilant in guarding the mild, feeble entities of earth, void as they are of lordship over ghouls and night gaunts. The mindless, shapeless blasphemies of outer space can yet control them when they must, so that it was not in state as a free and potent master of dreamers that Randolph Carter came into the Great One's throne room with his ghouls, swept and herded by nightmare tempests from the stars and dogged by unseen horrors of the northern waste. All that army floated captive and helpless in the lurid light, dropping numbly to the Ankh's floor when by some voiceless order the winds of fright dissolved. There, before, no golden dais had Randolph Carter come, nor was there any august circle of crowned and hollowed wings with narrow eyes, long-lobed ears, thin nose, and pointed chin, whose kinship to the carven face on Nagranich might stamp them as those whom a dreamer might pray. Save for the one tower room, the Ankh's castle atop Kadath was dark, and the masters were not there. Carter had come to unknown Kadath in the cold waste, but he had not found the entities. Yet still the lurid light flowed in that one tower room whose size was so little less than that of all outdoors, and whose distant walls and roof were so nearly lost in sight to thin, curling mists. Earth's entities were not there. It was true, but of subtler and less visible presences there could be no lack. Where the mild entities are absent, the other entities are not unrepresented. And certainly the Ankh's castle of castles was far from tenantless. In what outrageous form or forms terror would next reveal itself, Carter could by no means imagine. He felt that his visit had been expected and wondered how close a watch had all along been kept upon him by the crawling chaos. Nyarlathotep! It is Nyarlathotep! Horror of infinite shapes and dread soul, and messenger of the other entities that the fungus moon beasts serve, and Carter thought of the black galley that had vanished when the tide of battle turned against the toad-like abnormalities on the jagged rock in the sea. Gahtaya. So in the Gahtaya, it said that all these on the sphere of the moon. So this is right in line with what Aleister Crowley would have been saying in his, or the Goetia, depending on how you pronounce it, right? Reflecting upon these things, he was staggering to his feet in the midst of his nightmare company, when there rang, without warning, through that pale, litten and limitless chamber, the hideous blast of a diamond trumpet. 3 times pealed that frightful brazen scream, and when the echoes of the third blast had died chucklingly away, Randolph Carter saw that he was alone. Whether, why, and how the ghouls and night gaunts had been snatched from sight was not for him to divine. He knew only that he was suddenly alone, and that whatever unseen powers lurked mockingly around him were no powers of earth's friendly dreamland. Presently, from the chamber's uttermost reaches, a new sound came. This, too, was a rhythmical trumpeting, but of a kind far removed from the 3 raucous blasts which had dissolved his goodly cohorts. In this low fanfare echoed all the wonder and melody of ethereal dream, exotic vistas of unimagined loveliness, floating from each strange chord and subtly alien cadence. Odors of incense came to match the golden notes, and overhead a great light dawned. Its colors changed in cycles unknown to Earth's spectrum, and following the song of the trumpets in weird symphonic harmonies, torches flared in the distance, and the beat of drums throbbed nearer amidst waves of tense expectancy. Out of the thinning mist and the cloud of strange incenses filled twin columns of giant black slaves with loincloths of iridescent silk. Upon their heads were strapped vast helmet-like torches of glittering metal, from which the fragrance of obscure balsams spread in famous spirals, and their right hands were crystal wands whose tips were carven into leering chimeras, while their left hands grasped long silver trumpets, which they blew in turn. Armlets and anklets of gold they had, and in between each pair of anklets stretched a golden chain that held its wearer to a sober gait. That they were true black men of Earth's dreamland was at once apparent, but it seemed less likely that their rites and costumes were wholly things of our Earth. 10 feet from Carter, the columns stopped, and as they did so, each trumpet fell abruptly to its bearer's thick lips. Wild and ecstatic was the blast that followed, and wilder still the cry that chorused just after from dark throats, somehow made shrill by strange artifice. Then down the wide lane betwixt the 2 columns a lone figure strode, a tall, slim figure with the young face of an antique pharaoh, joyous with prismatic robes and crowned with gold bechent that glowed with inherent light. Close up to Carter strode that regal figure whose proud carriage and smart features had in them fascination of a dark entity or fallen archangel, and around whose eyes there lurked the languid sparkle of capricious humor. It spoke, and in its mellow tones there rippled the wild music of Lethean streams. "Randolph Carter," said the voice, "you have come to see the great ones, whom it is unlawful for men to see. Watchers have spoken of this thing, and the other entities have grunted as they rolled and tumbled mindlessly to the sound of thin flutes in the black ultimate void, where broods the diamond sultan, whose name no lips may utter aloud. When Barzai the wise climbed Hatheg Claw to see the greater ones dance and howl above the clouds in the moonlight, he never returned. The other entities were there, and they did what was expected. Zeneg of Apharat sought to reach unknown Kadath in the cold waste, and his skull is now set in a ring on the little finger of one whom I need not name. But you, Randolph Carter, have braved all things of Earth's dreamland, and burn still with the flame of quest. You came not as one curious, but as one seeking his due, nor have you failed ever in reverence toward the mild entities of Earth. Yet have these entities kept you from the marvelous sunset city of your dreams and wholly through their own small covetousness. For verily they craved the weird loveliness of that which your fancy had fashioned, and vowed that henceforward no other spot should be their abode. They are gone from their castle on unknown Kadath to dwell in your marvelous city. All through its palaces of veined marble they revel by day, and when the sun sets they go out into perfumed gardens and watch the golden glory on temples and colonnades, arched bridges and silver-basined fountains, and wide streets with blossom-laden urns and ivory statues in gleaming rows. And when night comes, they climb tall terraces in the dew and sit on carved benches of porphyry, scanning the stars, or lean over pale balustrades to gaze at the town's steep northward slopes, where one by one the little windows in old peaked gables shine softly out with the calm yellow light of homely candles. The entities love your marvelous city, and walk no more in the ways of the entities. They have forgotten the high places of earth and the mountains they knew that knew their youth. The earth has no longer any sway on unremembered Kadath. Far away, in a valley of your own childhood, Randolph Carter, play the heedless great ones. You have dreamed too well, O wise arch-dreamer, for you have drawn dreams' entities away from the world of all men's visions to that which is wholly yours, having builded out of your boyhood's small fancies a city more lovely than all the phantoms of that have gone before. It is not well that earth's entities leave their thrones for the spider to spin on, and their realm for others to sway, in the dark manner of others. Fain would the powers from outside bring chaos and horror to you, Randolph Carter, who are the cause of their upsetting, but they know it is by you alone that the entities may be sent back to their world. In that half-waking dreamland, which is yours, no power of uttermost night may pursue, and only you can send the selfish great ones gently out of your marvelous sunset city back through the northern twilight to their wonted place atop unknown Kadath in the cold waste. And whether you evoke or invoke or whatever your spiritual practice, it comes through you. As above, so below. It comes through you. Do you understand?